Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to unpack what might just be the most bizarre, mind-bending historical paradox I have ever come across. Seriously, if you're fascinated by how history is written and, rewritten, you are in exactly the right place. We're going to look at a 300-year public relations campaign that literally inverted reality. We are talking about the ultimate historical rebrand. Just let this question sink in for a second. How on earth did a man completely infamous for his brutality, a literal mass murderer, become an officially venerated saint? Because, believe it or not, today, the man who physically ordered the crucifixion of Jesus, Pontius Pilate, is actually worshipped as a saintly hero in the Ethiopian and Coptic churches. It sounds impossible, right? No way. But, as we'll soon see, political necessity is an incredibly powerful tool. All right, let's dive right into this roadmap of a rebrand. We're going to trace this massive transformation chronologically, moving through 4 documented phases to see exactly how this happened. Starting off with the anatomy of this paradox and how propaganda actually rewrites history.
Now, before we get to the man himself, we really have to understand the mechanism that made his rebrand possible in the first place. It all basically boils down to a concept called pia fraudis, which translates to a pious lie. This is religious propaganda used to rewrite history for political or theological pragmatism. It's the idea that a fabricated story is totally acceptable, maybe even holy, if it serves a greater political or theological need in the present moment. Think of this concept as the absolute engine driving Pilate's 300-year PR campaign.
So let's look at the historical butcher and ground ourselves in the actual first-century reality. What's incredibly fascinating about this baseline reality is how wildly it contrasts with the myths that came later. Secular first-century historians like Philo of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus describe Pilate as an absolute monster. Just listen to the words Philo uses: bribery, violence, robberies, oppression, insults, constant executions without trial, and endless, unbearable cruelty. I mean, wow. This is not some conflicted, gentle ruler pacing his chambers. This is a corrupt, ruthless tyrant. In fact, the true Pilate was such a butcher that even the Roman Empire, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly known for its gentle human rights record, found him entirely too violent. In 36 AD, shortly after Jesus' execution, Rome officially recalled Pilate and stripped him of his power for massacring a crowd of unarmed Samaritans on Mount Gerizim. To this cold, pragmatic Roman dictator, the life of a wandering Jewish preacher was essentially worthless. The crucifixion wasn't some great moral struggle for Pilate. Actually, scratch that, it wasn't a struggle at all. It was just a routine piece of morning bureaucracy. Moving into the second phase, we start seeing the very first twist in the historical record, shifting the blame. So, the crucial point here is that early Christians had a severe political problem on their hands. In 70 AD, the Romans completely destroyed Jerusalem following a massive Jewish rebellion. Suddenly, the new Christian movement needed to survive in an empire that was highly, highly suspicious of them. They had to urgently distance themselves from the rebellious Jews and prove their unwavering loyalty to Rome. But they had a massive PR hurdle to clear. How do you explain to the Romans that your founder was executed by the Roman state without making the Roman state look like the bad guy?
Well, you shift the blame. And you can actually track this logical, step-by-step evolution across the canonical Gospels as time progresses. In the earliest Gospel, Mark, Pilate is a bit distant but ultimately yields to the crowd. But then we get to Matthew, and Pilate dramatically washes his hands of the execution. By the time we reach the later Gospels of Luke and John, Pilate has essentially become a defense attorney. He actively fights for Jesus' release, repeatedly declaring, "I find no guilt in him." The blame has strategically shifted entirely from the Roman state to the local Jewish leaders. And this presents a rather brilliant piece of historical irony. That incredibly famous scene in Matthew where Pilate washes his hands to claim innocence, well, ritualistically washing hands to claim innocence was a purely Jewish custom. A hardened Roman aristocrat and prefect would absolutely never have done that. But the narrative needed him to do it. The pious lie took its first major step. Pilate was no longer a state murderer. He was just a weakling, pushed into an execution he didn't want by a hostile crowd. Which brings us to phase 3, forging a secret believer through Apocrypha and early texts. Between the 2nd and 4th centuries, the early church doesn't just make Pilate a sympathetic coward. They begin actively rehabilitating him. This perfectly illustrates the massive gap between gritty reality and the snowballing myth-making machine.
We go from a historical Pilate who viewed executions as boring morning bureaucracy to an apocryphal Pilate who, in texts like the Gospel of Nicodemus, is suddenly having deep, respectful theological debates with Jesus. He admires him. The early church was essentially transforming this Roman prefect into a secret undercover Christian. But to back this up, they needed evidence, so they just made it up. Early Christian figures like Tertullian began spreading what we now know are massive forgeries called the fake imperial letters. These letters claimed that Pilate wrote an official report back to Emperor Tiberius in Rome, officially confirming that Jesus performed genuine miracles and even rose from the dead. The forged letters went so far as to claim Pilate suggested the Roman Senate should formally make Jesus a god. Of course, none of this ever happened. It is a textbook pia fras designed purely to convince local pagans that, hey, even your own Roman prefect secretly knew Jesus was divine.
Now let's move to phase 4, the absolute peak of this historical fiction. The ultimate martyrdom in Eastern Christianity. In regions like North Africa and the Middle East, the myth was driven all the way to its absolute logical extreme. Texts like the strangely named Book of the Cock present an astonishing, fantastical climax to the story. They claim that Emperor Tiberius summoned Pilate to Rome to answer for the crucifixion. But when Pilate arrives, he presents Jesus' tunic to the emperor and openly prays to Jesus. In response, the emperor has Pilate beheaded, not for incompetence, but for his newfound Christian faith. The legend even claims that as Pilate was executed, a voice from heaven called out, entirely forgiving him and cementing his status as a martyr. Which brings us right to this specific date, June 25th. Now, why does this matter? Because this ancient, fabricated PR campaign isn't just history. It directly impacts modern religious practice today. June 25th is the official feast day in the Ethiopian calendar for Saint Pontius Pilate and his wife, Claudia Procula. They are venerated as holy Christian martyrs. Just think about the sheer scale of that paradox for a second. The man who historically commanded the brutal torture and execution of Jesus Christ is officially worshipped as a saintly hero. It's an absolute masterpiece of historical rebranding. Let's move to our conclusion and see how this all builds into a fascinating lesson about controlling the narrative. Briefly reviewing this whole 300-year timeline, the progression is super clear. In 36 AD, Pilate is a man so violent, the Romans actually fire him. By 70 AD, early Christians, out of sheer political necessity, shift the blame away from him in the Gospels. By the 2nd to 4th centuries, pious forgeries have smoothed his edges entirely, turning him into a secret believer. And finally, Eastern traditions elevate him to a martyred saint. It's a 300-year evolution from monster to martyr, built entirely on a sequence of consecutive pious lives. And that leads us directly to the core thesis of this whole explainer. In religious texts, the winner isn't who has the truth about the past, but who controls the narrative in the present. Political pragmatism completely and quite easily overwrote historical fact. The early church urgently needed a friendly Roman, so they quite literally wrote one into existence, completely erasing the first-century butcher in the process. It really makes you stop and think about the stories we take for granted, doesn't it? If a documented, ruthless, mass-murdering dictator can be successfully transformed into a holy saint just because a group of people needed a better narrative, well, I want to leave you with this question to ponder. What other historical truths that we widely accept today are actually just the result of a very successful, centuries-old PR campaign? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.